Welcome to VCR, a vintage cinema rewind. We're bringing old movies to new viewers. I'm Blake.
I'm Jason. Move 'em on.
Head 'em up.
Head 'em up.
Move 'em on.
Move 'em on.
Head 'em up.
Rawhide.
Cut 'em out.
Ride 'em in.
Ride 'em in.
Cut 'em out.
Cut 'em out.
Ride 'em in.
Rawhide. We're doing the Blues Brothers.
Blues Brothers, 1980.
Oh, what a classic.
Yeah, very fun movie.
Oh, this is one of my favorite, if not my favorite comedy of all time.
It was always on my list again, but like the musical aspect kind of threw me off, and so it kept like getting bumped down my list as I thought like saw new movies and stuff. But then like it's classic people involved and like a classic movie.
And what's great about this movie is not only is the movie absolutely hilarious, and we'll talk about who this was for in a minute, but the movie holds up from a comedy standpoint. It's got a whole lot of history involved in it, so many historical figures involved in the filming of the movie. Like it's a great movie all around. Like there's just so much that this movie has going for it. And, you know, I don't have a single complaint about it. In my mind, this is a perfect movie.
Yeah, it depends on which version you watch, but it can be a little bit long. I watched the extended cut, and
okay.
so like it felt a little bit dragging on in certain areas, but then in certain areas it drags on to a perfect degree, which I think is so intentional.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah, it's so fun.
It's like when somebody, you know, has a joke and it's like kind of funny, but they just keep like, you know, keep digging in and digging into the joke, and it becomes hilarious.
Yeah, like it becomes unfunny and then becomes funny again.
Yeah. It's like Will Ferrell, like some classic Will Ferrell kind of stuff.
I was just gonna say that exactly. Like it's probably like a big inspiration for him, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely. Like this kind of movie would have inspired all of the mid 2000s comedians, because, you know, the Blues Brothers is a musical comedy starring Dan Akroyd and
Jim Belushi.
Yeah, and John Belushi.
John Belushi, yes. Yeah,
Don't you bring this Jim Belushi down bullshit into our into our episode. No, the great legendary John Belushi together. It's two SNL alum. This is an SNL movie essentially, and this would have influenced all of the films that you and I love from the early 2000s from our childhood. All of, you know, the movies from Will Ferrell, all of the Adam McKay stuff, all of the Judd Apatow movies with Seth Rogen and Jonah Hill, everything.
All of SNL and any SNL type movies that came out in the 90s and 2000s and
easily,
continued to come out. Yeah. Like Adam Sandler.
Oh, and even more so like Chris Farley, right? Like Chris Farley was heavily influenced by John Belushi, like in his mannerisms, the type of humor, like the very physical type of humor, right?
Yeah, like it would have given him such a good figure to look up to and base his stuff on, even though like he already had so much natural, just raw talent, but giving him something to like go towards a little bit.
Yeah, and unfortunately in more than one way, the good and the bad.
Yeah, exactly. Go into a plot summary then, eh?
Yes, so this is also just the primer episode, so this is going to be a spoiler-free discussion of this beautiful comedy, and we'll dig into all our favorite comedy bits in the second part, the deep dive of the Blues Brothers, which will be coming out a week after this episode.
All right, so The Blues Brothers is a ridiculous 1980s movie about two brothers dressed head to toe in black on a journey to get the band back together.
A journey from God.
So they want to put on one big show and make $5,000 to save their orphanage that they grew up in. Massive ensemble cast here, like we said, based on John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd's SNL characters that they created they created the characters and then made this movie like fairly quickly. I feel I don't actually know. Do you?
Yeah, they created the characters in the mid 70s, I think around 78 or so, and that's when they actually got a band together. Was the other kind of big component of this, because well, you know what? Let's talk all the history about that in the deep dive episode. But you know, this is a crucially important film for SNL, for comedy, for music. and even for cars as well, which we'll talk about
Yeah.
later, and action movies.
Yeah, and so the characters they created was in 1978, and then they made the movie in 1980, just because they were so funny and such like a great character trope that they were playing at.
And the music itself is actually really good as well. And they actually did do some concerts and tours and stuff like
Yeah.
that. You can even catch them occasionally, even now. The band is still together.
Yeah, and they bring in, just like in the movie, so many great musical artists to like collab with.
Yeah, exactly. Like, this would be an event worth going to. If I ever saw that the Blues Brothers were playing in Ontario, I'd be there in a heartbeat.
Oh yeah.
You also don't think about like how, so the music of the film, it's the Blues Brothers, so it's obviously, heavily influenced blues, jazz. There's a bit of rock and roll, a little bit of country involved in here, but jazz is just so influential to so many different types of music, and a lot of the mainstream stuff that is really popular today is kind of derived from jazz and blues, right?
Yeah, and there's so much that like comedy goes in with that too, because it's so off the cuff and like creative. So I think that makes sense why they loved it.
And it's such a classic comedy. Like, yeah, like let's talk really quickly all of the characters and people you should know, and then I really want to discuss with you whether the film holds up today still, and who the movie is for, because I think that's actually going to be a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, it's tough to say. Like we'll have to get into that for sure. Where do you want to go first?
So I want to talk characters and people you may know. So John Belushi, one of the most famous stars, comedians of the late 70s and the early 80s, before, he unfortunately passed away at 33 of an overdose. Have you seen a John Belushi movie before, or is this your first time experiencing John Belushi?
I think technically this is my first time. Like, yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Cool. Before I'd seen this movie, I did see Animal House, and he definitely carries that film as well. And, people growing up around the same time period that we grew up in, we know Chris Farley is the obvious person that I think about, similar comedian to him. And so if you're a big Chris Farley fan like me, you're going to naturally be attracted to somebody like John Belushi.
Was he in Little Shop of Horrors? Is that like, wasn't he supposed to be, or is that?
I don't know. There's a lot of films that John Belushi was supposed to be the guy for before he passed away, and we'll talk about that in Legacy actually a little bit.
Yeah.
In the deep dive, because he was a big hole of the 80s. I think the 80s would have been a very different time for movies if he had been able to keep his drug problems under control. The brother, or I guess we should have said too that
his character,
John Belushi is also playing the character of Juliet Jake Blues, of the Blues brothers, like they're two brothers that grew up in an orphanage together. I love how at the beginning of the film they have their names like on their fist. It's like one of the first gags of the film is like it says Jake over the four knuckles, and then Elwood has to be spread against both hands.
Yeah.
So speaking of Elwood Blues is played by Dan Akroyd, the other brother, who you most likely, especially for Canada, because he's a Canadian comedian, would know his name, but most famous from Ghostbusters, obviously, big, important SNL original cast member, I believe, and he was also famous for Coneheads. He's been in dozens of comedy movies between the 70s right up into the 2020s. Like, he was in the most recent Ghostbusters film that Paul Rudd starred in, which was okay. But he makes a lot of appearances here and there in comedies today still.
Yeah, he's just like he just does smaller stuff now, I feel, but he's always, people revere him because he was so big.
Yeah. So important to the 80s as well. And then we get into like the just massive cast and crew of this film, and I'm just gonna list off I think a lot of the important actors of the film, and the musical appearances and the actress appearances that happen throughout the film. The only person that I do want to mention who's relatively vital to the whole story is Cab Calloway, one of the musical appearances. He kind of plays like the fatherly figure to the Blues Brothers. He was the janitor, maintenance guy at the orphanage where they grew up in. You know, we see them early on when they go and visit them. He really took them under his wing, taught them all the music, taught them how to play the instruments and everything, and kind of basically passed on his appreciation for this kind of music to them. And he's a real famous musician from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And we actually get a number from his that made him the most famous. He actually gets to perform it as well later on in the film, which is really cool.
Yeah, Minnie the Moocher.
Minnie the Moocher. Yeah, one of my favorites of the film for sure.
And yeah, just like as I was watching this, because I didn't know that much about it besides the few like quotes that are like super popular. I was just watching this movie and I was like, wait a minute. That's like James Brown. That's Cab Calloway. Like Cab Calloway, I was like, I know that voice because I have listened to like a fair amount of blues. But and then yeah, just
Ray Charles, man.
Yeah, Ray Charles shows up.
Aretha Franklin.
Yeah.
And so these names, you might not be able to put the face to them necessarily, but as soon as they start singing, you know, it starts to connect. What's really great about this film is on the end credits, they do one of those like end credits where each person gets a screenshot of who they are and their name underneath, so you can kind of connect the person to the music afterwards. There's a lot of respect for the genres that they're portraying and the people they're portraying.
And if you watch this like in theaters, you would have known everybody.
Oh,
and
sure.
It would have been like crazy to see them in a movie, especially like a comedy movie based on SNL. Like, and SNL was such a phenomenon. But anyways, yeah, there was John Candy. Who else?
So, do you want to talk musical appearances first or actor appearances first?
I was just going everywhere, so if you want to go in a certain...
I've got the list of musical appearances here. We've mentioned James Brown already, Ray Charles, Aretha Franklin, and then we've got the group of guys who are in the Magic Stones.
Yeah.
And so that's Steve the Colonel Cropper, Donald Duck Dunn, Willie Two Big Hall, Tom Bones Malone, Blue Lou Marini, and then we've got later on Matt Guitar Murphy, Mr. Fabulous Alan Rubin, and John Lee Hooker even makes an appearance later on in the film. We've got Twiggy, Chaka Khan, and Joe Walsh even has a brief appearance from the Eagles. So there is like so many names there to chew on.
Just peppered in there. Did you mention you haven't done actors yet?
We haven't done actors. You want to say a few of the actors? And we've got some important directors involved in this as well.
Oh, no way. I didn't even look into that. There's so much going on. But so I just noticed Paul Rubin, who is Pee-wee.
Yeah, who unfortunately just passed away.
Yeah, very recently. And then John Candy, who is like hand in hand with John Belushi and like that time.
Another big influence for somebody like Chris Farley for sure. Carrie Fisher.
Yeah, Carrie Fisher. Yeah, like that would have been absolutely massive that she was in there and like
coming off the Star Wars, man. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Carrie Fisher, a lot of like, the serious actors in general are also like really good at comedic timing. And Carrie Fisher has a great performance in this one.
Yeah, really fun.
And then I'll talk about a little bit of the directors that make appearances. Did you notice Steven Spielberg's in this film?
No.
He plays the Cook County assessor. So at the very end of the film when they pay the $5,000, spoiler.
Oh, yeah, okay.
That was him. I didn't recognize him either because, my mental image of Steven Spielberg is like 50s, 60s, 70s Spielberg.
Exactly,
Spielberg would have been like 30 years old, maybe, at this point in time. Like when he made Jaws, he was in his 20s, right? So this is a really young Steven Spielberg.
Yeah, wow.
There's also Frank Oz in this film.
I saw that he's at the beginning.
Yeah, he is the corrections officer.
That intro to what Jake's character is, what he had in his pockets as he was going into jail.
So funny.
That was so funny. And
it's one of those jokes that continues on, like we were saying, and it gets funnier as it goes because of all the ridiculous stuff.
Yeah.
And so Frank Oz is actually a name that you might not have heard of before, but trust me, he is so important to your childhood. He was the guy, one of the creators of The Muppets with Jim Henson, The Dark Crystal. He directed the Star Wars, the OG Star Wars films. Like, one of the most important directors of the 80s by a mile.
We wouldn't know him. I don't know if anybody at that time really knew him. So like he probably was just, I don't know why was he included? I know he's huge for that time.
He
but
must
like
have been
would people
friends
have
with the
really
director,
known? Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So
Like this was such a fun set to be on, I'm sure, just because you're
my
getting
God.
everybody.
It was chaos, and we will talk about that later in the deep dive discussion. Because it was basically a big party on set all day, every day, especially with John Belushi being around.
Oh yeah,
when he was available.
yeah.
So let's talk the director as well, really briefly. John Landis, a director that's very important to that time period, has somewhat fallen out of favor at this point. Like, he was the director who also did National Lampoon's Animal House. He has An American Werewolf in London, Trading Places, Three Amigos, like all of the big comedies of the 80s, really. He was the guy. He also directed Thriller, like Michael Jackson's music video.
Oh, crazy.
Yeah. A little bit of, a checkered past. He directed parts of the Twilight Zone film, and he was acquitted for the death of somebody on set, but all of the incident around it, like Steven Spielberg and him were very good friends beforehand, and they stopped speaking after that and all of the incident around it. So, like I said, he was acquitted. He wasn't the charges were eventually thrown out or whatever. But yeah, it's a little bit of a checkered past. So probably a name that you don't actually know as much about anymore. Yeah. All right, who's this movie for? Does it hold up to a modern watch? And that's the first question I'm going to pose to you. Does this movie hold up in 2023?
I would say some of it. If you could watch this in parts, I don't know, I think you would need a modern edit or something like that for it to work. But
yeah, we might have to talk in the deep dive about maybe what you found didn't hold up necessarily.
Yeah, because there's quite a bit of comedy that does hold up, but then some doesn't, and then just the long cuts, the long scenes and stuff like that, can get a little bit much. But
yeah, because I think a lot of movies of this era and this type of comedy end up being a really tight 90-minute, hour and a half type film, right? And this one being just over 2 hours, being about 2 hours and 15 minutes, it does feel a little bit longer. It's probably closer to like a Judd Apatow length comedy, and there's always issues, trying to keep the comedy fresh throughout the film, right?
Yeah, and I watched the extended cut, which is 15 more minutes of probably they were probably cutting some of the things to make it connect more, make it quicker, but that definitely affected a little bit.
Yeah, I haven't seen the extended edition actually before, so I actually can't speak to what's being added essentially, and whether or not that is maybe where you were struggling with a little bit. But what I can speak to is, in my opinion, I think if you're watching the original theatrical cut of the film, I think for the most part this film holds up extraordinarily well. And part of the reason why it holds up is because this isn't a mean-spirited comedy at any point as well, right? There's no jokes that are edgy or that would be considered racist or sexist per se, or just not in the contemporary taste of moviegoers. There really isn't anything horrifying about this film that really makes you go, ooh, they shouldn't have said that kind of thing.
Yeah, but just to I agree with that, but at the same time there's nothing that really just makes you fall out of your chair laughing.
I will say there is one scene in particular that gets me every time I watch this film. The first time I watched this film, there's one scene that made me cry. I was laughing so hard.
Nice. Okay. So I'm looking forward to hearing about that.
Yeah, it's a little bit to the, the taste of what your comedy is like, right? Like I heavily grew up around the films Ghostbusters, Indiana Jones, like a lot of the 80s influences, right?
Yeah.
And so my comedy is more skewed towards like a Dan Aykroyd, Bill Murray type of humor, Chevy Chase
Hmm.
humor. So this kind of really feels at home to me. But if you're not as up on that specific time period of comedy, yeah, you know what, this doesn't quite click for you right away like it does for me.
Yeah, and that's where like I really enjoyed it, and I was laughing, and like there are parts that I really love, but I think for a modern audience, it's going to be a tough sell unless you're going into this with the mindset of you're watching like something that's like movie history and enjoy it for like watching a John Belushi performance that was just awesome, and like the Dan Aykroyd style of comedy, especially like for Canadians, because you can hear his Canadian like
Yes, you
accent
can.
so strongly, and yeah, I think it's like a culturally important movie.
It'd be interesting because I know my parents are big fans of this movie, but it'd be interesting to show somebody like our friend Calvin this who is not into older movies and see if this holds up to him. Because, I'm certainly biased on a movie like
Yeah,
this. And so, maybe some experimentation is needed.
yeah,
Um, but anyway, I think, in my opinion, who's this movie for? Well, in my opinion, this is one of the best musical comedies ever made. I can't think of too many more musical comedies that I would go to before I'd land on this. I've honestly made this at this point. It's an annual watch for me. I've been watching it for the last 4 to 6 years, every year, once a year, because I've loved it so much. It's also just a little bit of nostalgia for me. But not only is this a movie for people who love comedy, but again, it's a movie for musicians. Like this just has so many important historical figures in it. Like it just becomes like a time capsule of
yeah,
all of these people. Like I can't even believe, coming at this movie in the 2010s when I started watching it, I couldn't believe like Ray Charles was alive for something like this, right? Like that
yeah,
just blew my mind when I was like, "Oh my god, that's Ray Charles." Like
yeah,
it's so cool to see all of these very important figures to jazz
yeah.
and blues.
And the scene with where they have John Lee Hooker playing Boom Boom in the
Mm-hmm.
marketplace, like that was such a cool thing for me because I love that song, and I had like no idea that he was going to be in this. I was like, "Oh my god, it's John Lee Hooker." And
Yeah.
like just if you don't care about music, it's a cool scene because you just see like pure 80s like New York or Chicago like busyness, like just
Yes.
like the backdrop of all the people was so cool to see, like the city
Yeah.
as it was like fully alive back in that day.
This is a love letter to Chicago just as much as it's a love letter to the musicians that inspired Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi.
Yeah, yeah.
So the other thing that I'll say as well is this movie is also kind of a low key like car driving movie,
Yeah, yeah.
which I never really considered that until this watch, where I was like, there's a lot of time spent in the car on the road going from one place to another, shenanigans ensuing. There's playing music with your buddies in the car,
Mm,
fun crazy car chases. Like some of the biggest car chases ever on film happen in
yeah.
this comedy, which is
And
wild.
they just go on for so long and it gets funny. Like it's
They get like
hilarious.
more and more crazy and ridiculous as
Yeah.
they go.
Yeah.
Like I'm really excited to talk about actually little details of each of the car chases that I always really appreciate on every rewatch of this film,
Yeah,
because
no
this
doubt.
film is very rewatchable as a comedy in my opinion.
I think so too. I don't know if I would go yearly, but I might. I might
Yeah.
after this. We'll see.
So I guess the other thing to understand my comedic taste, like if I'm putting comedies on a pedestal, this one's up there for me with like The Big Lebowski. Like that, The Big Lebowski and this are the two movies that if I'm scrolling through Netflix and I haven't come up with what to watch yet, if I land on one of these two, I'm gonna giggle to myself and then I'm click and play
Yeah, yeah.
every time, every time.
You would for sure.
Yeah.
I see that. Yeah.
Yeah. So those are my comedic tastes to kind of understand where I'm coming from with this. When to watch. This is a great late night comedy.
Yeah.
Like, this is when this is meant to be watched as a late night comedy. It's grown actually as a cult film for late night comedies as well. So you probably could catch this, if you're flicking through TV channels, if you have TV channels in 2023. Right
You're at
now,
your grandma's house or something.
yeah. Oh my god, if your grandma has a VHS tape of this, I'm coming over to your grandma's house to watch this with her. Where to watch? Unfortunately, this isn't streaming on anything. You have to rent it. So I rented it through YouTube. This was on Netflix like 2 or 3 years ago, because that's one of the first times that I caught it, or second time or whatever. So
yeah, hopefully it pops back up every once in a while, because it's such a classic.
Yeah, this could even make an appearance on Tubi. This would be a great film to pop on Tubi at some point. I wouldn't be surprised by that. So yeah, kind of just if you're not willing to pay the money to rent it, just have an eye for it and check it out when it comes to your streaming platform, because it's really, I think in my opinion, it's worth the watch.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's it for the spoiler-free discussion. So if you're interested in this film, go check it out. Come back next week, and we're going to dive head on into spoilers, what we liked, maybe what didn't hold up in your opinion as much, and just dive into all the background of the making of the movie.
Forward to it.
Cool. All right. Until next time.
Rawhide.